everybody's okay with the meeting being recorded, I'm going to start recording now. So Ahmed has been a participant. He's been active as a thinker and participant, rather, in left-wing struggles in Johannesburg for more than 2 decades. His dissertation was entitled "The South African Diagram: The Governmental Machine and the Struggles of the Poor," and was completed in 2013. Subsequently, he's written on political theory and social struggles, with his writing appearing in Social Dynamics, Social Dynamics, African Studies, the Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, South Atlantic Quarterly, and the New South African Review. Today, his seminar is entitled "Frank Talk: Rethinking Foucault's Concept of Paresia from Johannesburg." And we're really delighted to have you here. I would ask that for the course of the seminar, just to help bandwidth, that people turn off their cameras and their mics. And Ahmed will speak for about 45 minutes. He'll share his screen if he needs to. And then we'll have about 40 to 45 minutes of Q&A. So thank you all for joining us. And I'll hand over to Ahmed.
Okay, thank you. Can you all see and hear me okay? Everyone can see and hear me okay?
Okay, yes.
Yeah, all right, cool. Okay.
At least I can.
I'm going to try and jump right into it because I haven't timed this talk, so I have no idea if I'm going to make the allotted 45 minutes. Just to say, as a kind of preface, when Bernard first asked me to present something, the idea was that I would talk about my work on the relationship between water loss auditing and commodification, which is the project that I've been working on for the last couple of years. But in the last few months, I've gotten lost in something else. And so I asked him if I could rather present about this new project I'm working on that's focused on Foucault's concept of Paresia and Pico's Frank Talk. So that's really what this talk is about. And this project actually started out as a chapter of something else I was trying to write about Foucault's idea of critique and Paresia, and it spiraled into something else that is no longer about Foucault, something I like. And what it's actually about is a practice of Frank Talk, written Frank Talk, written Frank hyphen and then Talk, the way it is in the poster. So I'm not really looking at the chat. So if there's something that I need to know, maybe Bernard will just let me know what's going on. I've dropped into the chat a kind of framework of this talk, which is still quite loose. But I hope that you see where I'm going with everything. So to start out, let me give you an introduction to the project. Okay. So in 1969, the South African Students' Organization, SASO, held its first General Students' Council, and they elected Steve Pico as the formation's first president. Pico, however, only served 1 term as president, and at the second General Student Council in 1970, he opted to take on the seemingly more low-key portfolio of publications director. 2 months later, the first SASO newsletter dropped, and it famously contained an occasional column called "I Write What I Like," and it was signed Frank Talk. Now, as everyone, as everyone will probably know, the figure behind the pseudonym was Pico. And his "I Write What I Like" column and the SASO newsletter more generally went on to play an important role in the clarification, development, and popularization of what we call Black consciousness. Written when Pico was in his mid-20s, these essays are some of the basic points of reference for those grappling with his intellectual legacy. And through these columns, an idea of frank talk has become part of our political imagination in South Africa. So after Pico's death, this name became something like an open identity taken up for insurgent intellectual projects. So for instance, in 1984, the Natal region of Azapo launched their critical journal called Frank Talk, and its first issue carried an image of Pico on the cover and an editorial that claimed to be unashamedly dedicated to his memory and the propagation of the philosophy of Black consciousness. On this side of the transition, Frank Talk was reclaimed with the launch of a publication called New Frank Talk, which self-characterized as critical essays on the Black condition. There was also like an attempt in the 1990s to integrate Pico's idea of frank talk into counseling and psychotherapy. But even beyond these kinds of appropriations, the name Frank Talk and the title of Pico's column, I Write What I Like, they've become, or they've been taken up by a wide range of people, and one can find dozens of plays on them in South African political literature. So today, provocative public commentators promise to tweet what they like, and radical poets undertake lyrical ontological manifestings with the declaration that they will make what they like. Now, in these kinds of rememberings of Pico, which have been going on now for close to half a century, what is being referenced is something more than Pico's ideas. What is being referenced is Pico's fearless and uncompromising intellectual practice and the disposition that sits behind it. The Pico as pose that people imitate when they say, I'm going to write what I like, is that of someone who will deliver a discursive act unrestrained in its fidelity to one's own thought. So it's the critical pose then of someone willing to risk themselves by truthfully and frankly speaking their mind with an attitude of fearlessness. And now this is often what we remember when we remember Pico. Now, one way of describing what my project is about then is to say that it is focused on a practice of frank talking, which in the South African context is associated with Steve Pico and the BC movement of the 1970s. Pico's political practice is therefore the key point of reference in my attempt at showing the political potential of a frank-talking politics, and one that I suggest might be taken as an exemplar for doing militant critique. But this is also a project about a coincidental connection between Pico's critical intellectual practice, his pseudonym, Frank Talk, and a subject that came to occupy the French philosopher Michel Foucault in the last years of his life. So in the final two courses that he delivered at the College of France, 1983, 94, titled The Government of Self and Others and the Courage of Truth, respectively, Foucault's lectures focused on a genealogy of this ancient Greek concept of Paresia. And in relation to this concept, Foucault undertook to discuss practices of free frank speech, of fearless truth-telling, and their transformation over the course of several centuries. Now, superficially, the coincidental connection between Foucault's lectures on Paresia and the practice I highlighted in my prefacing comment about Pico is that frank talk is actually one way of translating this Greek concept of Paresia. Obviously, though, I want to say something more than this. So, frank talk, I'm going to argue, wasn't just a pseudonym for Pico, and his fearless mode of engaging in public political critique was more than just an extension of his individual bravery or a personal quality unrelated to his theory. For Pico, a particular way of speaking frankly, of fearlessly telling the truth, came to be a self-conscious aspect of the political perspective he was developing, and it was his mode of critiquing the apartheid state and the forms of opposition that had emerged to it. More importantly, though, this critical frankness, as he also called it, was the form that is, was the form that his political engagement with blacks took, and in this context takes on a distinctly constitutive register. Now, in the early years of the Black consciousness movement, its most militant acts were discursive, and in this period, it completely altered the terms of public discourse between blacks and whites, and about whites and the system of apartheid. We could say that BC unleashed a critical energy on the 1970s, that in laying bare the apartheid relation as an antagonistic relation, self-consciously set out to destroy the norms for black political speech. And Pico's "I Write What I Like" column and its particular mode of truth-telling was an important source of this new energy. Now, seen in this light, it would not be hard to extend Cornel West's appraisal of Malcolm X as the great figure of revolutionary Paresia to Pico as well. As West tells it, he takes the term Paresia from Plato's The Apology, where Socrates says that the reason he became the subject of so much criticism was Paresia, his fearless, frank, unintimidated speech. West remembers Malcolm X then as a Paresiast, which is to say someone who uses Paresia. Then, for the degree to which Malcolm X was willing to engage in unintimidated speech in public about white supremacy. And he goes on to say what Malcolm does is he begins with this notion of the world making being black a crime. He responds to this condition of being cursed and trapped by courageously exemplifying what it is and means to say, I am unafraid, I will speak my mind. And one can obviously see the connection between that mode of framing and Pico's practice. Now, stepping off from these remarks, in a way, what I want to try and do in this project is to pull out of Foucault's lectures on Paresia a profile of a practice and of this practice and the one who uses it. Then I'm going to take this profile and I'm almost projecting it onto Pico, but in a way that allows me to redraw that profile in Pico's image. Anyway, this crude operation, which is likely to produce some monstrous results, I'm hoping also will produce some other political effects. In this talk, though, I want to start by simply showing how Foucault defines Paresia, and then I want to link it to aspects of Pico's political practice. All right, so moving on to the second section, Foucault's definition of Paresia. But first, some quick notes on Paresia. Now, etymologically, it means simply say everything, and it could be used in a positive sense, but also in a pejorative sense. It first appears in Greek literature in the 5th century BC, and here it is associated with Athenian democracy and the freedom of every citizen in Athens to not only speak in the assembly, but to voice frank criticism. And it is really something that comes to be seen as characteristic of the Athenian character. And the Athenians, they even named a ship at some point, Paresia. With the decline of democracy in Athens, however, this term comes to take on meaning in more autocratic systems of government as well. And very importantly, it takes on a meaning in philosophy. Now, with respect to the latter, Paresia gets linked to an idea of the true life. So, for instance, in Plato's profile of Socrates, the latter is someone whose virtue is in part is going to consist in the ways in which what Socrates does, his conduct, is in conformity with what he says, his discourse, his Paresia, his frank talk as well. In this way, Paresia gets linked to a form of life, which is also the true life. Now, part of the kind of enthusiasm that has followed the publication of these lectures center on this aspect of Foucault's genealogy, and specifically how a parasiatic form of life comes to be expressed in, for instance, the militant practice of the Cynics, where the philosopher Diogenes is a paradigmatic figure. For this talk, though, I want to bracket off Foucault's 1,000-year genealogy of the concept of Paresia. And what I want to simply do is to underline how he defines Paresia, focusing on what is probably the most general and schematic definition that he gives. And this is in a set of seminars that he presented at the University of Berkeley in late 1983. So, in these seminars, Foucault's orientating discussion of Paresia is organized around 5 characteristics. First, he says that when a subject uses Paresia, when a subject uses this particular mode of frankness, it implies that the speaker is going to be bound in a particular way to what they say, in the sense that it will be clear that what they say is what they actually believe. And this is going to be communicated without any embellishment or rhetorical devices to hide, veil, or mitigate what the person really thinks. Secondly, although the term was sometimes used in a pejorative sense, for instance, the impertinent chatterbox who doesn't just say anything, everything, but says anything, in its positive meaning, according to Foucault, there's an exact coincidence between belief and truth. Paresia for Foucault is more than frankness insofar as what the subject believes forms a closed circle with truth. The paresiast says what is true because he thinks that it is true, and he thinks that it is true because it really is true. And this binding of truth and belief happens actually through the practice of paresia. At the same time, and this brings us to the third characteristic, every coincidence of belief and truth is not necessarily paresia. A teacher, for instance, explaining a geometrical theorem might believe in the truth of the statements they deliver to their class, but this is not likely to involve paresia. According to Foucault, there must be some risk in the act of speaking the truth for us to talk about paresia. And he gives this example that is actually taken from Plutarch's Lives, which I think is very interesting. And he says, when a philosopher addresses himself to a king, to a sovereign, to a tyrant, and he tells him that tyranny is unable to make him happy because tyranny is not compatible with justice, in this case, he says the philosopher says the truth. There is an exact coincidence between belief and truth, and more than that, the philosopher takes risks, because the tyrant might become angry, may punish him, may exile him, may kill him. So while the risks of using paresia, of speaking frankly, will be different depending on context, risk and danger are going to be constant. But again, not every act of speaking the truth which carries some risk is paresia. Paresia, according to Foucault, has an interlocutory structure between two parties, where the one who uses paresia is going to risk angering the other by speaking the truth. This is going to mean that paresia always involves some form of criticism, whether of the self or of the other, who might become angry or react negatively to the truth expressed. And Foucault suggests that there is generally a structuring inequality in paresiatic scenes. Paresia comes from below, he says, and is orientated to those above. The first point, then, is that paresia operates as a form of criticism, and one where the paresiast stands in relation to inequality to the individual this criticism is directed at. Right. And then finally, the paresiast who says what he thinks in the spite of the risk of speaking, who tells the truth in the form of a critique of the other or the self, does so as an act of duty. The paresiast is not forced into confessing his critique and might well have remained silent. For Foucault, paresia is in this sense an act of freedom, since things could have been left otherwise, and the way in which the paresiast expresses his freedom in speech. As a duty, then, this seems to be a duty that the self gives to itself. Okay. Now, in his Berkeley seminar, when he sums up paresia as a form of truth-telling, a critical truth-telling coming from below, Foucault says the following. He says, so we could say that paresia is a certain verbal activity in which the speaker has a specific relation to truth through frankness, a certain relation to himself through danger, a certain relation to law through freedom and duty, and a certain relation to other people through critique, either self-critique or critique of other people. More precisely, it is a verbal activity in which the subject expresses his personal relation to truth, and he risks his life because he recognizes that telling the truth is his own duty, so as to improve or help other people. In Paresia, the speaker uses his freedom and chooses truth instead of lies, death instead of life and security, criticism instead of flattery, and duty instead of interest and selfishness. And he adds, this is the general theme of the word paresia in the positive sense of the word in most Greek texts from the 5th century BC to the 5th century AD. And although I think we need to be a little bit more cautious. This way of defining paresia is in fact Foucault's own. And in a very real sense, we can, based on this definition, we can actually speak not just about the concept of paresia, but I think also Foucault's concept of paresia. But we can talk more about that in question time. Now, improvising of Foucault's Berkeley definition of paresia and these 5 characteristics, we can already put down a few notes for a profile of a paresiast. We could say that the philosopher, when he's using paresia, he tells the tyrant what he thinks, and he does not try to hide it in any way. Simply put, the philosopher, when he's using paresia, speaks frankly. Although it will be clear that the philosopher is frankly stating his opinion when he is using paresia, he is also stating his opinion because it is the truth, and he says what he knows to be true. But paresia is also going to involve some kind of danger and will therefore require courage. The paresiast tells the truth, a critical truth, in spite of the risks it might entail, and he does so because he's bound to the act of telling the truth out of duty. Now, off these notes, things seem easy, right? Pico was a paresiast because he spoke the truth. The danger was real, and he knew it. He continued to speak the truth anyway, and they killed him for it. All this is true, but things seem to me formally more complex as well, but also theoretically more interesting. So part of what makes things more interesting for me is that Pico's paresiatic practice, his frank talk, is almost from the start connected to the idea of Black consciousness as a way of life. A way of life that I would add, we might suggest, is made in the face of death. Part of what I want to try to do in this project then is to show how Pico's frank talk, his way of talking about, and his way of talking about the meaning of Black consciousness more generally, emerge with a shift in the Black subject's relation to death, a shift expressed in the adoption of a new political commitment, or to use Foucault's term, a duty to oppose the forces of one's oppression in the very movement through which one undertakes work on the self in its relation to others. And in fact, this is part of what Foucault, I'm going to say what Pico means. What calling oneself for Pico, what calling oneself Black for Pico means. Sorry. So part of what makes things more complex, however, is the issue of anachronism. And there are a set of problems that I think are quite interesting that follow with any kind of attempt at drawing this concept of paresia out of ancient frameworks of subjectivity, truth, and politics, and putting it to work in a modern context. And in fact, some of these problems are so interesting that they are in part the motivation for the project, independent of what I want to say about Foucault or about Pico. Now, for me, you know, there are broadly 2 major scenes of paresia in Pico, right? So there's the first scene is similar to the kind of example Foucault gives, and the one that I highlighted, the philosopher speaking to the sovereign. And in a way, Pico's testimony in May 1976 at the Sasso trial is the kind of paradigmatic instance of that scene of Paresia, that scene of his frank talk where he's addressing the sovereign. And then, of course, there is another very important scene of Paresia or frank talk in Pico, and this is the scene in which Pico addresses those on the same side as him of a political struggle. And his "I write what I like" columns might be seen as the paradigmatic instance of this frank talking, this Paresia. In this talk, because this is what I'm working on at the moment, though, I'm going to talk about a slightly different scene, a scene that I think allows us to understand a little bit better the relationship between Pico's frank talking practice and the meaning of BC as a way of life. And this, what I'm going to talk say is in a way a bit speculative, but what the controversial claim that I want to kick off with is this. In the face of every practical restriction, Pico lives a form of life that is at the same time a practice of freedom. Now, in what sense can we make this claim? Now, at the end of "I Write What I Like," the book, there's a short extract of an interview that Pico did some months before he was arrested, and it's titled "On Death." Although we are not told the question Pico was answering in the passage, it seems likely that he was asked if he was afraid that he might die at the hands of the police. But whatever prompted his response, though, the answer he gives is telling of something more than just his attitude towards death. And as I said, paradoxically, this passage is going to tell us something about the meaning of BC as a way of life. And so I'm quoting from Pico here, and he says, "You are either alive and proud or you are dead. And when you are dead, you can't care anyway. And your method of death can itself be a politicizing thing. So you die in the riots. For hell of a lot of them," he says, "in fact, there's really nothing to lose." Almost literally, given the kinds of situation they come from. So he says, if you can overcome the personal fear of death, which is a highly irrational thing, you know you are on your way. Now, although rhetorically provocative, the first sentence here presents a challenge. And it's not easy to see why Pico it's not easy to see why Pico brings all of this together until you said something like living with what Foucault characterized as the indirect forms of biopolitical murder of state racism, the reason there's really nothing to lose, against a form of life that is related to death now in a completely different way. So the choice for me that the passage foregrounds is therefore important. And one way of reading it is to say, either you accept the biopolitical or social deaths of apartheid, or you take up another way of living in which pride and refusal become synonymous. And what I mean here by death, biopolitical murder and so on, we can talk more about in the question time. But what is important at getting at the parrhesiatic character of all this is that for Pico, choosing this way of living proudly, also means choosing the risk of another kind of death. And now not simply a form of indirect murder or living with the risks of death, but now accepting the possibility of a more overtly violent and even political death. For instance, death in the riots, as he says, or even through banning, which is a form of political death, or ultimately from blows dealt out by the security police, which is in fact how Pico died. Now later in this passage, Pico connects this choice to his experience of interrogation and the attitude that he adopted towards it. So quoting again at length from Pico, he says, "I was talking to this policeman and I told him, if you want us to make any progress, the best thing for us to do is to talk. Don't try any form of that rough stuff, because it just won't work. For I couldn't see what they could do to me, which would make me all of a sudden soften to them. If they talk to me, well, I'm bound to be affected by them as human beings. But the moment they adopt rough stuff, they are imprinting on my mind that they are police. And I only understand one thing, one form of dealing with police, and that is to be as unhelpful as possible. And I told them this, it's up to you. We had a boxing match the first day I was arrested. Some guy tried to clout me with a club. I went at him like a bull. You see, the problem this guy had with me, he couldn't fight with me because it meant he must hit back like a man. But he had instructions, you see, one on how to hit. Now, these instructions were no longer applying because it was a fight. So he had to withdraw and get more instructions. So I said to them, listen, if you guys want to do this your way, you have got to handcuff me and bind my feet together so that I can't respond. If you allow me to respond, I'm certainly going to respond. And I'm afraid you may have to kill me in the process, even if it's not your intention. These last two lines for me are very important, not only because they may say something about the way Pico died, but also because they are a good example of a frank talking practice. And of a frank talking practice, I want to bring something more out about. Now, there are obviously many ways in which this passage can and has been read. Working off our discussion of Paresia, what I want to do is to come at it by literally fictioning a scene of it that places it within a framework of relations, within the framework of relations that we encountered in our discussion of Paresia, framework of relations between power, subjectivity, and truth. All right. So here is the scene. So you have a white interrogator and a black detainee. By 1977, it was already established that a black detainee could be killed by his white interrogator, and this killing would de facto occur without the commission of homicide. Now, not only can the detainee not leave the interrogation, he is also compelled under the threat of violence to answer the interrogator's questions. Now, if one reads the account of Peter Jones of his interrogation and torture following his arrest with Pico in August 1977, what also becomes clear is that what the interrogator is after is not really truth. What is more important than truth for the interrogator is that the detainee betray those he is associated with, and his cause. In a way, in fact, the detainee is being compelled to betray himself and betray what he believes in. Now, putting all this together, we might say that the scene of the interrogation is characterized by a mode of subjectification through a form of speech about the self in its relation with others that is compelled by violence. This would imply, though, a stability of the relation of inequality between, on the one hand, the one who has the capacity to use violence and therefore ask the questions, and on the other, the one who must answer these questions and then only answer them in accordance with a structure which is in a way set in advance. And the interrogator will say, well, we know everything already, but you still have to say it. All of this, of course, will also depend on the effectiveness of the interrogation technique. And the violence that is deployed is going to be based on a form of knowledge. That is, it is a rationalized means towards ends that include but are also deeper than simply the production of a written confession or the gathering of new pieces of intelligence. Now, working off this fiction framework, if we now read the two sections of the passage that I quoted together, living proudly seems to imply a mode of living that is firstly a refusal of subjectification within a relation of inequality. And in the case of the interrogation scene, of the role of the one who must answer questions in accordance with the ends of the interrogation. Pico is not, however, Bartleby. The refusal is total. But it is also not enough. In this scene, in which Pico has very little practical freedom, his refusal is still only one moment of a wider strategy for defacing the ordering practices that underlie the relation of inequality between the one who asks the questions and the one who must answer them, between the interrogator and the detainee. But, and what I want to highlight, it is not just in hitting back when struck that Pico does something more than refuse the terms of the interrogation, but rather it is in the relation that comes to be established between his frank talk and his hitting back. To draw some of this out, I want to pick out an interesting asymmetry between this scene and one that is found in Herodotus, but which is presented in far more lively terms in Rancière's Disagreement. So I'm quoting now at length from Rancière's Disagreement. The Scythians, Herodotus tells us, customarily put out the eyes of those they reduced to slavery, the better to restrict them to their tasks as slaves, which was to milk the livestock. This normal order of things was disturbed by the Scythians' great expeditions. Having left to conquer Media, the Scythian warriors plunged deep into Asia and were held up there for a whole generation. Over the same period, generations of sons was born to slaves and raised with their eyes open. Looking around at the world, they reached the conclusion that there was no particular reason why they should be slaves, being born the same way their distant masters were and with the same attributes. Since the women who remained behind permanently took it upon themselves to confirm this natural similarity, the slaves decided that until proved wrong, they were equal to the warriors. They consequently surrounded the territory with a great big trench and armed themselves ready to hold their ground when the conquerors should return. When the latter finally showed up with their lances and bows, they thought they could easily clean up this little cowherd's revolt. The assault was a failure. One of the sharper warriors, however, took the measure of the situation and summed it up for his brothers in arms. So he says, "Take my advice, lay spear and bow aside, and let each man fetch his horsewhip and go boldly up to them. So long as they see us with arms in our hands, they imagine themselves our equals in birth and bravery. But let them behold us with no weapon but the whip, and they will know that they are our slaves and flee before us." And so it was done with great success. Struck by the spectacle, the slaves took to their heels without a fight. So in this story from the ancient world, why do the masters win? They win simply because they are convinced of their natural superiority, while the slaves, on the other hand, hesitate in their sense of their own equality. Confronted with these Scythians who know themselves to be masters, the cowherds remember they are slaves. What also caught my eye in this account is the apparent division we have here between two forms of ordering practices, or rather we could even say two modes of subjectification connected to violence. When the Scythians take up their bows and lances, the cowherds imagine themselves their equals. However, when approached with whips, the Scythian becomes the master and the cowherd becomes a slave. We might also add that because of the character of the master and slave's respective relations to themselves, it is the former, the Scythian, who decides the term of the relation between them. The one who will be master decides between war or subjugation of the other in slavery. This is, of course, a relatively simple framework, and I'm, of course, not suggesting we can take much from it about ancient relations between master and slave. What is more interesting here for me is what Rancière picks out of it. For him, he says, the problem is that the slaves in this account can't transform their equality in war into political freedom. Now, it strikes me that in the scene fiction of Pico's statement on death, things are different. In fact, it's almost opposite. In spite of the fact that in this case, all practical freedom is on the side of the interrogator. And it's on the side of the interrogator through the doubling up of an inequality in relation between white and black, between interrogator and detainee. And Pico, he is not going to deny the materiality of these relations. They are real, they are grounded in actual forms of practice. But he also doesn't surrender what Brantier perhaps means when he talks about political freedom to these relations. These relations for Pico do not represent some metaphysical foundation of the world, but are relations that are established and sustained in and through practice. Pico's political freedom is therefore expressed in the first place through a practical critique of the terms and relations of the interrogation, which is also an attempt to subvert and deface them. And what underlies this expression of freedom, this, or rather practice of freedom, is Pico's sense of his equality with any and every other. Pico gives his interrogator a choice. He says, we can talk, but don't expect me to betray my comrades or myself, or we can choose rough stuff, in which case I will hit back. So either you concede my equality and we do this politically, or you choose war. It's important to notice that both options open to the interrogator effectively mean giving up the form of the interrogator-detainee relation. The interrogator's technique, the knowledge that he must apply in the situation is now also foreclosed. There is no space for his rationalized violence crafted to get the detainee to betray his comrades and himself. But now, paradoxically, I suspect there is also a new possibility of subjectification of the interrogator in a relation of politics or war, which is to say also of equality with Pico, beyond the practical relations that structured the scene. It's important to say that in relation to Pico, I think, and just to kind of start wrapping this up, you know, we know that all of this happened. I mean, Pico actually went at a bull, like a bull, when struck by one of his interrogators. And I think that if you read the account that Peter Jones gives of Pico and his arrest, as well as other evidence that emerges within the context of the Pico inquest, it does seem likely that Pico, that this might have happened again. And so the question I want to ask then is this an example of parrhesiatic practice? So when Pico says frankly to his interrogator, politics or war, you choose, this statement in the form of a choice functioned as a practical critique and a refusal of the interrogator-detainee relation. In this sense, it potentially disrupts the ordering practices that underlie this relation. But it is also a statement that on its own is neither true nor false. Where truth lies is in the promise of one or other response to the choice presented. If the interrogator chooses politics and Pico talks to him honestly, telling him also what he won't tell him, or if the interrogator chooses rough stuff and Pico hits back, then in both cases, Pico spoke the truth. Nobody can be sure about how Pico died, apart from the men who we know lied about it. I suspect, though, it involves something like Paresia, a critique that came in the form of a promise made true in the relation between a frank talking discourse and a form of action imminent to it. All right. Now, as I said, there are lots of examples in Pico of parrhesiatic practices that are a lot simpler. And I think, nobody would deny that Pico was courageous. It is also easy to show that he believed in the truth of what he said, and so did others. What he said was also not easy to say, and he showed his willingness to pay the cost of saying the things he said. And there's lots of examples of this. And so in this sense, it's not hard to see how you can make an analogy between Pico's public political speech and Paresia. I don't think that's questionable at all. A problem surfaces, however, is that if you try and go beyond this, and this is exactly what I want to do. So after all, frank talk, if you read I Write What I Like, is a pseudonym, properly written as you would a proper name, and therefore not some hyphenated, postmodern looking shorthand concept. let alone something representing an original contribution to critique. Or is it really that? Now, surely this fake name can't seriously be, surely this fake name, you can't say it's going to carry the weight of this concept of Paresia. But this is where things get interesting for me. You know, there are times when you're reading philosophy when it becomes possible to pick out something innocent looking, you know, a term or phrase in a work, and then that transforms how we're understanding it, allowing us to draw out new dimensions that for whatever reason weren't visible before. And, you know, if you read Deleuze's book on Foucault, you'll see, you know, he takes out this concept of the diagram from a passage in Discipline and Punish that seems like it's, you know, just an ordinary kind of usage of the term, and it becomes a central concept in Deleuze's reading of Foucault. So I think I'm doing something like that, I hope. But in this case, there is something more also here that's going on here. So in the first two issues of the newsletter, the Sasso newsletter, that were launched immediately after Pico was elected as the Sasso publications director, the newsletter was no more than a typed up booklet made up of A4 sheets filled with densely packed text. And so someone had to kind of sit and type all of this up and then find a way of getting it copied. And in these two issues, where Pico would have been closely involved in all aspects of the publication, this pseudonym is written with a conceptual inflection. And the articles are signed off at the end, Frank Talk, precisely with the hyphen in between Frank Talk and placed in inverted commas. And it's not just in one issue, it's in both the first and the second issue. However, the next time that I Write What I Like column appears, the newsletter had been given a new, more professional-looking two-column layout scheme and a new prominent headline style. And in the case of the column I Write What I Like, there's now also a more traditional byline, Frank Talk, written like a proper name. Now, although I'm still trying to confirm my impression, I suspect that this shift came about as the editorial team expanded and they secured resources for laying out and printing the publication. And as Pico himself becomes less involved in the actual mechanics of how the article was set out for printing. Now, if all of this seems to you still too speculative and eccentric, I want you to also note that some years later, in a very different, more intimate concept, conceptually developed idea of an orientation to frankness appears again. Now it's almost as an apology to a friend he was concerned he had offended by telling him how he felt about an intrusion. And in this letter, Pico writes that often what I call critical frankness, and so this is a quote, often what I call critical frankness sounds much sharper than intended and tends to assume holier than thou proportions. So what is important to note here is not only the suggestiveness of this term, critical frankness, which seems to me to be an elaboration on frank talk in precisely the direction of the concept of Paresia, but the way Pico prefaces it with the idea, what I call. So he's saying, you know, what I call critical frankness. So this then is not just any concept for Foucault, for Pico. It's not some spontaneous formulation that he just blurted out, but it's a concept that he calls his own. Now, in all likelihood, Pico would have not encountered the concept of Paresia. I mean, one place he might have, I think, is in his reading of theology. And he certainly was very interested in this already when he was in high school. But I think whether he knew the concept of Paresia is immaterial. For me, he's self-consciously developing a practice that could be described in these terms in relation to his frank talk or critical frankness, which is to say the names he gives to a practice of speaking about the social order and the subjects of that order under a heading that is already a declaration, I write what I like. I suspect one would be hard-pressed to find a better modern embodiment of the concept of Paresia and Foucault's assertion that the parrhesia is someone who emphasizes his own freedom as an individual speaking. I mean, I write what I like. This, however, is a freedom practiced on the other side of any given freedom. All right, so that was the talk, and I think I finished in 45 minutes.
Thank you, Ahmed. That was wonderful and extremely stimulating. The way we're going to do questions and comments is that I'm going to look for hands. I understand that people who are not subscribed directly to Teams don't have access to the chat, but please please try and raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you, and then we can take three in a row. I hope that's okay with you, Ahmed. So I'm looking right now for hands, okay. So just to get you started, a small question perhaps. Is there a difference in your thinking, or is there any stakes in Paresia in the directly spoken word versus its circulation as text? And I was particularly taken by the end of your talk and thinking about the distribution of the pamphlet and its naming and fashioning, and what are the stakes of the comparison of the interrogation and your analysis of the interrogation and Pico's rendering of that and transformation of relationship immediately with the interrogator versus the circulation of frank talk as a text in pamphlet form in either version. And I'm looking for hands. You can respond to that or give some thoughts to that while we look for some hands.
Okay, I do see some hands, but I'll answer that question. It's not an easy question, precisely because in the examples Foucault kind of normally gives, it is often not Paresia that took a written form. It's accounts of Paresia that take place in an interlocutory structure or within the assembly. Pericles' famous funeral oration is one of these kind of paradigmatic examples. I do think that, though, that once we move into the modern era, one might need to rethink inflections of Paresia in relation to other modern forms of media. And so that's partly what I'm doing. But I will say that there is another very obvious problem in the saying that, what Pico does in I Write What I Like, in the Write What I Like columns is Paresia, because after all, he's using a pseudonym, right? So that binding of the subject to what he says is at least obscured initially, right? We don't know when the newsletter drops, we don't know that it's actually Pico who's speaking. And so there's a question about how we deal with that. I think for those who know the kind of history, it's a nice problem, because when the political stakes become real and Strini Moodley is actually charged with being Frank Talk, Pico comes to court and he says, actually, I'm Frank Talk, and he doesn't do it like in a way that, it's like the ease with which he does it is also so beautiful. And he says, well, I'm Frank Talk, and this is what I meant in these articles. And he goes on to explain in the testimony that the reason that he used the pseudonym was that it was important for the BC movement to ensure that there wasn't an identification of ideas with an individual, but instead that it opened up the possibility of a collective identification with the ideas. So in this sense, almost, BC was enlisted at the beginning, everyone to be Frank Talk. Anybody could be Frank Talk, and everybody was enlisted to actually use Frank Talk in speaking. So I think that, on that that's a whole other section that I've worked on. The stuff that I talked about today is what I was writing now. So I thought I'd just kind of test it out with people. So most of what I do is actually focused around his testimony during the Sasso trial, which is a far clearer example, or it fits the kind of Foucauldian mold much more clearly. But I'm also doing something else, right? So I'm in a way, I think this concept of Paresia is interesting, but ultimately I don't think I want to use that concept. So partly what I want to do is I'm almost working off Pico and Foucault's concept, Pico's concept of frank talk, Foucault's concept of Paresia, in order to say something that I'm hoping is going to be beyond both of them. That is something, a form of militant critique that allows us to kind of rethink what we mean by critical theory, maybe. Anyway, so that's the big ambition.
Thank you. That's great. So let's take. I see 4 hands at this stage. Let's take the first 3, and then that's Shahid, Shai, and Stephen in that order. So Shahid from our department, Shai Gortler, postdoc at UWC, and Stephen Robbins from our departments. Go ahead, Shahid.
Great. Thanks so much, Ahmed, Prof. Yeah, I found it really, really exciting, and just to follow your thought. I guess I have a few points. The one I'm thinking of, what happens when frank talk becomes commodified, right? To use your poetics, when the revolution is televised, right? Because, I'm thinking of the moment, the student movement, and I like the way you link it to courage, it's an ethical disposition. So in a way, you're talking about an ethical politics, right? Ethical in the sense of speaking to good, but also about the self, and it's a relation to the self. When that relation is commodified, what happens to it? I mean, I don't really have an answer. It's just in general. It's not very specific. The second point, I'm thinking here with the paper, somebody called Jay Schutter. In fact, it just came out in Social Dynamics. It's actually about the EFF, but he links a certain kind of political practice to what he calls a pragmaticism. So he calls it a Pico's pragmatics, or the pragmatics of BC. And in this pragmatics, which he goes back to that court case, the famous transcripts, and it comes good to what you are talking about, in the sense that it's about a kind of a critique, which is actually about exposing the structures, so the possibility of. So I think the way that you speak about, the interrogation room, right? From what I understand, that really fits. So maybe you could just have a look at this idea. And he seems to suggest in his paper, it's very preliminary. He seems to suggest that there's a pragmatic philosophy, pragmatic in the sense of, not semantics and concepts, but actually, structures, how things work, that actually runs all the way through a certain kind of, black thought. And he wants to see that all the way to Du Bois and in Fanon and all these kind of radical thinkers. So it just seems quite interesting that I like the way you pull that out. His 2 options that he presents in the interrogation room, they actually destabilize the whole idea of interrogation and speech. So anyway, that was not a question. The last point, short point. What do we do with the academy, right? Because a lot of the humanities and social sciences is not premised on frank talk. It's premised on the production of concepts, and then a kind of semantics, right? A kind of a refining of concepts, and then playing with concepts and turning them around. I'm thinking even about, if I give you an example, say, we have this history of apartheid and colonialism and all kinds of genocides, and we have this history, they have this colonial complicity of anthropology. But if you look at a lot of textbooks, for example, written about anthropology in the contemporary, they now say that no, the problem was, ethnic, they call it ethnic. So I mean, we know this, but I'm wondering, what is the does an academy look like? What does sociology or anthropology look like when it engages in this kind? Do we shed concepts? Do we make new ones? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Stephen? Sorry, Shai? Shai, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. And thank you, Ahmed. Let me know if you can't hear me or anything. I'm not sure if this equipment works too well. So I have two questions. The first is, I guess, the obvious one, which is, what is your response to a critique that would say that perhaps Steve Biko is the last person on which you should impose a Western construction, if we believe Greece is of that, against Bernal and Black Athena, and more specifically, Foucault in his Berkeley years. What would happen if you would invert it, sort of, to maybe use Biko to shed light on Foucault? You started treating this in your response to Bernard, but I want to hear a bit more about it. The second question is, first, to say that I heard two dichotomies in your lecture. One is a dichotomy between social death and pride, and the other is between war and politics. And I wonder if there isn't a danger in that dichotomous view of these terms, in that, well, to begin with, it stands in direct contradiction to the frame of the thinker you're working with Foucault. So for Foucault, a relation in which someone is completely tied down, unable to move at all, has no freedom, is not a relation of power. It's a question of force, of violence, but it's not a power relationship, because there is no freedom, and therefore is it of very little to no interest to Foucault. Foucault's concept, which you use, is subjectification as opposed to subjection. So something that always already requires some action, some freedom to be held by the subject in place. And we can add to that a third differentiated concept, which is practices of freedom, which you also use. And so with subjectification, the danger is that the route of pride or of politics can also be dangerous, in that a subject can be formed by their actions. So with Biko, maybe we don't know, right? Because with Biko, he was killed. So we cannot guess, we cannot assume, not even as an experiment, what would have happened either if Biko had become alive. To demonstrate this, there are some arguments very quickly that sort of we can compare Sobukwe and Mandela. So Sobukwe silenced completely, Mandela a prisoner, yes, but kept alive, had conversation, chose politics, right, to use your language, had conversations with his jailer. But some would say that that was still a process of subjectification that has significance, and not necessarily in the positive sense. So to give another sort of more flesh to this question, Foucault, some say his interest in Paresia is in the Berkeley years, precisely because of Berkeley's sort of the freedom of the free speech movement, the student movement. And again, it invites a comparison between Biko's student movement and Berkeley's student movement. But the critique against sort of that Berkeley moment of the 1960s, 1970s is that it produced, or is largely responsible for some of the managerial politics of the present US, sort of, right? Everything that is based in Silicon Valley, but more than that, Laleh Khalili, for example, in Time in the Shadows, argues that sort of that managerial logic was applied in the US's conquest, and sort of specifically in its prisons in Afghanistan, sort of a managerial way to manage prisons, again, building on the freedom of those incarcerated within these prisons. So the question is, what do you see a danger in this dichotomy, and how, if so, how would you differentiate then the kind of politics, that third way, between a politics that can lead to subjectification and a politics that is in of itself a practice of freedom?
Stephen?
Do you mind if I in here, and then we go to Stephen, because that is both these kind of comments are quite a bit to kind of respond.
We'll take Stephen. Can you wait? I think that Ahmed has a lot to chew on there. So let's take you and Sage in the next round. Go ahead, Ahmed.
All right, I'm going to start with Shai. Let me just say that, you know, the speaking about social death, or kind of the characterization of social death, and I'm glad someone brought it up, was a provocation. You know, I was being slightly provocative and naughty here. To some extent, I think that I am thinking about the question of death in Pico. The question of death, kind of riffing off Foucault's final lecture in Society Must Be Defended, where he talks about forms of biopolitical murder, forms of killing, and so on, and which, because of their biopolitical character, I've associated with the kind of idea of the social. Now, of course, there's a certain kind of problem in doing that, and perhaps you also know why I'm being slightly provocative here. And what I'm also indexing is, of course, a set of other debates about the question about social death. Now, the kind of, for instance, someone like Wilderson, which I have real questions about whether it can be extended to South Africa and so on, and we can talk more about that. But in relation to the kind of, is there danger in transposing a Western concept onto Pico? Yes, there is. And in fact, what I'm doing begins in what actually a critique of aspects of Foucault's idea of Paresia. So it is not just a kind of simple transposition, but we must also remember that this idea of frank talk is genealogically connected to a notion of free speech, as I think you know. So, you know, for me, I'm not too afraid of this kind of dichotomy that I've set up, and I think that once, you know, I suspect that I've got a good way of accounting for it. But there is another issue that I think I'm finding a lot more interesting in your comment, which is that, you know, if we look at kind of Foucault's account of subjectification, it is often, and the ways in which he kind of talks about subjectification in relation to kind of power and knowledge and so on, you know, he never, until we kind of come to the kind of Paresia lectures, he never really kind of deals with this question of subjectification from the side of a subject involved in some form of resistance. And so I think that that's partly what I'm interested in also about the lectures. But I suspect that here is precisely where we need to push beyond Foucault, is that we need to think about the question of subjectification from the other side, as it were, which I think the Paresia lectures open up for us, but they also like a set of problems, both in Foucault's reading, for me, of ancient texts, as well as, you know, in relation to Foucault's project more generally. I mean, there's one of the disconcerting kind of aspects of the lectures on Paresia is that, you know, we know Foucault as the kind of philosopher who spoke critically about truth in its relationship to power, and it seeded a kind of ambivalence in our ways of speaking and thinking critically, where it was very hard for us to speak about truth from our side. And so, you know, I'm also attempting a kind of dislocation of a certain mode of Foucauldian practice by kind of turning to Pico. So for me, you know, the dislocation here is more important. But I within what I'm doing, the problem that you raise is in fact an important thematic starting point for the project as a whole. And to be honest, it is at this point in time, quite honestly, an experiment. I'm not sure how this ends. And I'm unfolding this in a kind of writing project where every couple of weeks I send to a group of people something new that I've written, which, by the way, relates to a comment also that Shahid made, because, you know, part of the ways in which Pico, so I write what I like, columns emerged. And this, he says in an interview with Gail Gerhardt, but also, you know, like many people in the PC movement also kind of speak about this. There were these kind of sessions that they have where, you know, someone would throw out a kind of polemical point, and then they go at it for hours of debate. And out of this, a set of ideas emerged, which Pico then synthesized through his columns. And there's a very much a kind of collective character in the development of these ideas. And I'm hoping also in what I'm doing in these kind of engagements, I can also feed in these kind of questions that are being posed of the project. I will say also to Shai, the issue of pragmatics is quite an interesting one, because for Foucault, you know, at some point he associates Paresia with the kind of pragmatics of true discourse. But then later in the lectures, he kind of changes his mind, and he says, well, actually, he associates it with the dramatics of true discourse. The dramatics, and it's partly going to be about the ways in which in Paresia, through the practice of Paresia, there's a kind of form of relation that is established to the self. And I'm jumping around here, but I also want to come back then again to another point that Shai made, which is, you know, that there's this association with Foucault's, that the Paresia lectures are associated with the free speech stuff and so on. You know, I'm not really convinced by all of that. When I read the lectures on Paresia, it seems clear to me that he is not really sure what he's doing at first. You know, he comes at the concept, it first appears, I think, in 82, and there he connects it to kind of issues of like confession and so on. And it's part, or it's at least part of a genealogy of confession and practices in psychoanalysis and so on, where one speaks the truth about oneself. And he's really there interested in Paresia as a kind of something that the other uses in this in spiritual direction. And then later on, he only discovers the political itinerary of the concept, and that's where he kind of starts in 1983. And so, you know, those that think that, well, he's giving an affirmative idea of biopolitics, I think there's something there. I think there's probably something to what you're saying in freedom of speech. But my sense is Foucault, this was something that he kind of, it was a concept he bumps into, and he finds extraordinarily kind of interesting, and he kind of follows on with it. And some of what he does is complete experimentation. All right. I will say that also was finding in relation to Shai, on the question of subjectification, part of what, when I wrote that particular passage, and it is out of an interest in re-inflecting the concept of Paresia in almost a Rancierian accent. So the idea of subjectification that kind of functions in the scene that I fiction is probably closer to Rancière than to Foucault. But like I said, you know, it's not clear that Foucault gives us a ways of thinking of the question of subjectification on the side of the subject who resists. Anyway, so I'm sure I didn't do a great job on answering those questions, but they were quite challenging. Maybe I can come back to some of them later.
Okay, great. So we've got Stephen and Sage, and I saw Ilana's hand go up and then down, so I'm not sure if she wants to also ask a question. But let's get Stephen and then Sage, and then if Ilana wants to come in as well, she can.
Okay, mine will be a very brief question, come comment, hopefully. So, no, it's a follow-up on Shahid's question about, he spoke about frank talk being commodified, but it's sort of what political capital does Pico bring into the present. So I'm thinking of David Scott's Fanonian Futures, where we can't these days talk about Pico, think about Pico, without thinking about where we are, where we stand in different places, in the different post-colonial settings and so forth. So the performative becomes very important, and I would even use the word the mimicry of a radical articulation of BC through Pico without risk. And so I'm being a bit provocative because I want to cut to the chase here. So MPs who are presenting themselves as extremely radical and actually coming across as if they are facing the same power structure with its threat to their very lives and existence. You know, so how I'm curious about how effective that is in this current moment, that there's not a questioning about the salaries, the stability of livelihood. You know, so where do you speak from seems to be obscured through rhetorical strategies, devices, and harking back to what you've articulated now, what extreme courage Pico had in speaking truth in the interrogation. That's enough for now. But thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Thank you.
Okay.
Sage? Sorry, Sage?
Hi, thank you so much, first and foremost. I found it to be extremely informative. My question is, what does Paresia mean, as per Foucault's definition of free speech? What does Paresia mean for local South African youth activists inspired by Pico's legacy, in alignment specifically with protest culture on a political stage, and another emphasis upon social media? It seems more and more opinions are able to be expressed because of social media as a tool and a vehicle for expression. Does it carry the same weight given access? But also, what does inequality factor? How does inequality factor into this in terms of creating another marginalized community? I think we've all been able to witness and see what that means for South Africa, even within education, given data allowances and other factors. So yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Ahmed.
Okay, let me start with Stephen's question, and which is actually a part of Shahid's question that I forgot. You know, the question of the commodification of Pico is something I wrote about in an article that's in the book Pico Lives. And there is, I mean, I think we need to take seriously or try to think seriously about what the implications of not just his commodification through kind of being put on T-shirts and so on, but also his political deployment within different forms of nationalist projects. I don't think I've got a good answer to all of this. I'd like to think that partly what I'm doing is also a mode of contesting certain types of readings of Pico. And you know, one of the things I'm trying to think about, and I haven't quite figured out, is what happens to the concept of black that emerges within the BC movement. And you know, if I read this concept correctly, it is very much a concept about political subjectivity. You know, by taking on the name black, those from oppressed groups, you know, commit to fight against the forces of their oppression, and at the same time it involves a kind of reconstitution of a form of relation to the self. And it's made, you know, by assuming certain forms of risk through kind of political activism. In this sense, you know, there's a question about whether this idea that emerges of Black in the 1970s is possible to sustain outside of actually a fighting movement of that political subject, Black. So without the kind of Black consciousness movement that identifies Black in a particular way, can you really talk about Pico Black, as has often been done? And I think, you know, within the kind of fees must fall movement, although Pico is very important, there is problematization of the idea of Pico Black. And I think that this is in part got to do with the kind of confusion. You see, for me, what partly happens also is that the idea that the form of or the name Black as a political name in Pico's work becomes almost like a governmental category in the post-apartheid era that I don't think can be reconciled. So, for instance, the idea of Black in BEE, which, you know, is formally supposed to kind of reflect the kind of Pico's perspective, in the very movement or in the integration of that political name into a governmental framework, I think we've lost the actual meaning of Black in Pico. Having said that, I think what is important and interesting for me is the ways in which outside of you know, the specific kind of deployment of the term Black in anti-racist struggles in South Africa, I think that there's something interesting going on in the structure of the form of collective political subjectivity that is suggested by Pico. So, for instance, you know, it is a one that, in a way, remains a many in the ways in which he gives meaning to that term, and which I think is interesting, and that I think once we kind of return to that idea of a very explicit idea of Black as a political name, and the structure that implies also a particular structure of naming, I think we see something quite different from the kind of commodified or kind of, you know, Pico that is just simply a footnote in the speech of the Magnum leader or whatever the case might be. So that's part of what I wanted to say, and also coming to the question I was asked about, you know, how does this relate to kind of contemporary student movement and so on. What I think is quite interesting also about this concept of Paresia is there is also a kind of idea here of breaking with the kind of order of relations and the modes of speech that are meant to conform to those order of relations. And I think within the higher education sector, the kind of, you know, at a very basic level, there are certain injunctions on what can be said and what can't be said that I think a parasitic practice is necessarily going to problematize. And therefore, I think that, you know, there is something to the extent in the very ways in which certain problematizations of coloniality take place that involves an element of Paresia. Again, this creates a whole set of problems of how we account for the epistemological structure then of these kinds of statements from below, so to speak. And as I said, you know, these kinds of problems are part of my justification for working on this project. But I also think there are other ways in which this idea of Paresia actually is very important in the student movement. I became involved in the kind of protests in 2015 and 2016, and I participated in some of those massively inspiring open sessions that took place in Solomon House. But one of the things that also happened in there was a kind of strategic inertia where, you know, as the kind of conditions started to change, there was almost an inability from within the kind of collective to actually criticize aspects of the practice of the movement itself. And in there, to actually stand up in a movement and say, maybe, comrades, shutdown at the moment is no longer as useful as it ought to be, when many students were actually thinking this. And the fact that that wasn't said, that you know, that or in moments where actually that was said, I think we see a particular form of political courage surface that is important. And I think sometimes, you know, just calling out and saying that what we've all taken as what should be the basis of political conduct doesn't make sense based on such and such, I think involves a kind of courage that is akin to what we talk about in relation to Paresia. I'm not sure I kind of understood the question about the current situation in higher education, but, you know, at the moment, at the university where I work, basically what has happened is that the COVID restrictions have been used to basically basically push students out of campus and out into the streets of Braamfontein. And I'm sure you all know what happened last week as a consequence of all this. And I think that there is within the student movement, and I think within civil society more generally, I mean, I think that how we relate to these kinds of events, what we call out, and even in our own practice as teachers, whether we kind of allow these questions to surface in our classes and so on, is also requires forms of political courage that I think are related. But I'm not sure that really answers your question, nor do I think I have any good way of answering it.
Thank you. I see Shahid's hand. I don't know if that's a hand that just stayed up or he wants to have another go. Shahid, do you have a quick comment or
No.
Okay, great. Okay, well, it's pretty much 2:30, so I'd like to thank Ahmed as well as all the participants. I think that was an extremely stimulating talk. I'm sure that I'd certainly like to read it, and I'm sure many others would too. I thought the questions were also of a great standard, and it was a very stimulating discussion. So thank you for starting us off for this year with such a powerful and provocative talk. And I look forward to seeing the development of the project and to having many more discussions with you. And thank you all for attending. And I'm sure that Ahmed would welcome future conversation with all of you. So thank you very much for coming. And I'd love to give you a round of applause. So I don't know if it works on this medium though. So thank you.
From my side, Bernard, thanks for inviting me. To everyone who gave comments, I'm sorry that I probably didn't do justice to them, but they are stuff that I will hold on to and use as I develop this project. And like I said, I have still no idea how this one ends. Okay. And so thanks everyone for showing up.
Thank you all. And there'll be another seminar in 2 weeks, which will be an event around Rob Patman's work. I will let you know soon about that. Thanks again, Ahmed, and have a great day. Keep safe, everybody.
Yeah.